certain people died prematurely as a result of the stress and the like. But people had their lives and their children's lives absolutely ruined. And so the consultants were conspiring with the bankers to basically set up certain of the bank customers to steal from them, steal their assets in ways that were plausibly deniable, and then give backhanders to the bankers. Is that today, Lloyd's Bank, they always try to say this is HBOS and they apologize for HBOS's problem. But actually, this has been Lloyd's Bank running this since 2009, January 2009. And today, Lloyd's Bank are not admitting that anyone is a victim of this fraud. What the reality, the dreadfully sad reality of life in this country at the moment is that what the Post Office have done, what Lloyd's Bank have done, is the norm.
So, Paul, thank you very much for coming to talk to us. Can you give us a little background about your professional qualifications and your experiences? Because I know you started as a lawyer and you then went into business.
Well, that's it. I qualified as a solicitor. I practiced in a Mayfair practice for about 12 years. And I had various business interests during that time. And then I went into business full time. And a lot of that was with Noel Edmonds, who had been a client of mine. And he encouraged me to join him and to establish and run a lot of businesses. And so I got a lot of experience in starting things. A lot didn't work out, the nature of that sort of thing. Some of them worked extremely well. Learned a lot, experienced a lot, and was able to use my experience both as then a business person, but also a lawyer on all sorts of different sides of similar transactions. So it was sort of quite a complicated fraud in one sense and very simple in another. What happened was certain people outside the bank, certain business consultants, conspired with. So far, we only know of two. The two have been convicted because this was very much specimen charges against specimen people. The initial charge sheet was an awful lot longer. But for the realities of getting a conviction for fraud, you need to simplify it. Mm. And so the consultants were conspiring with the bankers to basically set up certain of the bank customers to steal from them, steal their assets. In ways that were plausibly deniable, and then give backhanders to the bankers.
Goodness.
It sounds completely unbelievable, which is how so many of this type of white collar crime manages to stay forever hidden.
And some people were bankrupted, weren't they? And
a number of people were bankrupted. Yeah. There is certain people died prematurely as a result of the stress and the like. But people had their lives and their children's lives absolutely ruined. I mean, there are people who had everything taken from them, were evicted from their homes in the early hours when their minor children were in bed and asleep, and physically evicted from their homes. There are people that couldn't afford to feed their children. Christmas Day, they would rely on handouts, tinned food for Christmas Day lunch. Others who couldn't afford to even clothe their children to go to school and would get hand-me-down shoes with holes in for their children. Real people suffering in this country inhumane treatment designed by the bank. And then when these people, some of them, despite being very ordinary, small business people, the sort of backbone of this country, when these people would complain, the bank and their advisors would just mislead them and obfuscate and lie. And very similar to another very high profile fraud, the post office fraud, would tell them with their version of the Jedi mind trick, but no one else has complained about anything like this. It's only you. So gaslighting, I think, is the modern term.
So the people who were denying that there was a problem were not the people who've been convicted of the fraud. It's people elsewhere in the bank who were responding to your inquiries, presumably, or their inquiries?
Yes, because what I've obviously subsequently, I've done a lot of research and gathered a lot of information. What my understanding is, and from the criminal trial, which the Lloyd's Bank, which bought HBOS in late 2008, early 2009, desperately tried to obstruct, according to the police. What came out in that trial is that Halifax Bank of Scotland knew as early as 2007 of this problem. And they either failed to investigate or chose not to investigate.
Unbelievable, as always.
So this is. I mean, we're talking to you because we were initially interested in the post office scandal and the experience of sub-postmasters who were also thrown into a kind of looking glass world where things are happening which are incomprehensible. And they are also now still facing a situation in which nobody is seriously acknowledging that the post office as a whole has been part of this experience that they've had. It's left floating in the air as to who is actually responsible for anything that happened. And presumably this is your experience of large corporations in this situation. I mean, or is it a freak experience to have Lloyd's Bank behaving like this? Have you come across other examples, is what I'm wondering?
Yes, I have. I work on a pro bono basis for individuals, helping them in certain situations. So I've actually come across this quite a lot. And the really worrying thing, and the thing that until 2017, and then with what's happened at the post office, which I've been following closely for maybe 18, 24 months, what the reality, the dreadfully sad reality of life in this country at the moment is that what the post office have done, what Lloyd's Bank have done, is the norm.
Right.
That's staggering.
And that is not, obviously I don't have experience of all businesses, but if you just read one broadsheet newspaper on a daily basis, barely a week will pass where one of the major firms of auditors isn't being fined or investigated for some particularly egregious problem. Silent Night and defrauding the pensioners was one a few weeks ago. The Wirecard fraud. Who were Wirecard's lawyers? Well, they were the same lawyers that looked after the post office and that looked after Lloyd's Bank. And you think, how are these organizations all gravitating towards the same few firms?
Do they use the same auditors as well? Do we know?
Most of them use one of 4 or 5 firms of auditors, certainly in this country, which is partly because the complexity of their businesses make it hard to use others. So that's a sort of quirk of the logistics of how businesses are run. But the thing that most people listening to this will initially struggle to believe unless they have read some of the excellent Nick Wallace's pieces on the post office and Computer Weekly's pieces on the post office or read the judgments, is they just won't believe that this is how people behave. But in my opinion, I think that there are very large parts of big businesses in the UK and America and elsewhere, but I'm focused particularly in the UK, that are basically organized crime. And I say that because obviously I've taken a particular interest in Lloyd's Bank, but if you look at Lloyd's Bank's financial records for the whole of this century, for the last 21 years, you realize that in fines, penalties, compensation, they've paid out approaching $100 billion. And, you know, I pause there because everyone talks about billions and this and that, but you've just got to think about how massive a sum of money $100 billion is. So on their legal fees, on their fines, on, you know, for things like LIBOR, rigging the LIBOR market, the HBOS fraud. Only a couple of weeks ago, they were fined another £97 million for mis-selling insurance. PPI is obviously the big one. And actually, every year, there's another fine or compensation or investigation. And there's a massive one looming at the moment, which hasn't come out of the shadows yet, which is the bank signature forgery campaign. And Lloyd's are in it up to here. And it could well submerge them. So they are desperately deploying the same playbook, which is there's nothing to see here. But so sadly, my experience is that it is commonplace within very highly paid executives in the City of London and their law firms and their financial advisors to look at what is honest and just as a sort of inconvenience if it gets in the way of them making money.
Do we have any examples in those cases that you've just listed, Paul, of directors offering some of their money, their payback, or bonuses, or even being told that they're going to lose their bonuses, or is this just nobody? It's a nice idea that actually nobody ever implements.
I think you could probably count the number of examples this century, despite the incredible financial crisis in 2007 to 2009, despite the LIBOR frauds, the PPI, everything else. I think you could probably count the number of individuals fairly low down the pecking order who have suffered any personal consequence on one hand of a rather clumsy butcher. It just doesn't happen. And what does happen, and why the playbook that they all use is deployed, is because it works. So what they do is they stall by denying, delaying, deflecting, and that creates all sorts of benefits for them. It wears people down. It makes them even more financially desperate for when the organization is willing to finally put some pennies on the table. It causes them to run up legal bills that they can't afford. Therefore, they need to have someone helping them, either pro bono, which ultimately has a limit how many years can someone do pro bono work without saying, I've gone as far as I can go, or they get litigation funding and the litigation funders think, well, this might cost $500,000 or $1 million. And once you're up to 2 million or 3 million, or in the case of the post office, the liability to the litigation funders was over £40 million.
Well, it swallowed up the compensation, hasn't it?
But it swallowed up almost all of the compensation. So they deploy it because it works. Most of the times it works. And what then happens is it's 5, 10, 15 years later, the post office, they were started prosecuting people 20 odd years ago. PPI, they were selling PPI in the early 90s. They continued selling it to 2012. They knew it was wrong from at least the early thousands, and there's some evidence that actually there were complaints about people in the late 90s. So they just stall these things for such a length of time that means evidence disappears because hard drives get thrown out, files are lost, people die, memories fade. And of course, one of the standard lines is, we have not found any evidence to support your complaint. And they wear them down. People get older. They start to say, you know, how long do I continue with this? They can't get the support, the emotional support, the resource support, or the money. And ultimately, on the very few that we learn about, and you look at the post office and the HBOS Reading fraud and the libel rigging and PPI, and you think, my estimate is that for every one of those, there are probably 30 others, big ones. So their tactics work for most, but those few that come out, the people who were the architects of them have seen the writing on the wall and they've left. They've carried on their careers somewhere else. They've got their bonuses. They've kept their bonuses. They are never going to be named and shamed because all these reviews and reports never name anyone. It's manager X, sub-manager Y. You know, that's how these reports usually read. You've got even the governor of the Bank of England in a very unseemly public spat earlier this year with the Treasury Select Committee because he tried to prevent Dame Elizabeth Gloucester in the London Capital and Finance Review. He said to her, well, I don't think it's helpful for you to actually name names. And she said, of course I'm going to bloody name names. And so that's the situation. No one is held accountable. And then they come out, as the post office has done, which I get particularly angry about, to just say, well, it's very disappointing about this historic issue. But it's not historic. The sub-postmasters are living it every day. The lies have continued until now. The lack of an answer, the lack of justice continues. But they claim it's historic. They sort of try and pretend that, well, we don't really, it's not helpful to find out who was responsible and what exactly they did, because the other common explanation as part of their Jedi mind trick is lessons have been learned. And you think, well, what lessons can you actually learn if you don't find out who did what, when, how was it not identified? If it was identified, why was nothing done? What is the culture that enables that and then ensures that it continues for years, if not decades, longer than it should? And I don't believe any lesson can be learned unless you find out the truth. And I don't believe that justice can be done merely by saying, when you're finally caught, I've been caught coming into your house in the middle of the night and stealing from you. Okay, I'll give you your money back. That isn't justice. Justice requires people who do wrong to be accountable and society to be protected from them. And in other crimes, people have criminal records. And whether that's particularly worrying crimes like child abuse or paedophilia or sexual predatory offenses, where societies know it's that person, it's Mr. X, we know what he looks like. If we know he's back in our village or our town, we can do something about it. We can protect ourselves. These individuals just turn up at another organization. We don't even know their names. I could be now dealing, or any of the victims of the HBOS Reading fraud could have in my current bank one of the individuals who was responsible for this or responsible for covering it up or turning a blind eye, I could be dealing with them now at another bank and I have no clue.
And I'm
you can't
picking
protect society if there isn't a deterrent.
No, I was picking up from what you were saying then, Paul, that clearly you think that, I mean, it can't just be one or two people in these organizations, can it? It has to be a huge number, surely, because you may not actually be doing the dastardly deed, as it were, but you know about it, and you don't do anything. Surely more people know than we imagine with any of these kinds of frauds, but they're willing to turn the other way, or maybe they are given some kind of reward.
Well, indirectly, I think they do benefit. And, this is in danger of becoming the longest podcast in the history of podcasts. But just to give you one example that again happens to involve Lloyd's Bank, because obviously that's where my personal particular interest lies. But you could similarly talk about the post office or others, Barclays. But Lloyd's Bank were found last year in a shareholder action that was brought. They were found by a court to have misled shareholders when they were raising funds following the disastrous acquisition of HBOS. So they bought HBOS and then they found out it was a basket case, supposedly found out after the event it was a basket case, and they needed to raise billions and billions and billions of pounds. And so they went to their shareholders, and the way the process works is there are lots of rules and laws about you have to give full disclosure to shareholders about everything relevant so that they can decide, do they want to subscribe for shares? And if they think this is a really bad thing, they might even decide to sell the shares they've already got. And at the time of this fundraising, there were tens of billions of pounds of emergency loans from the Bank of England that HBOS had. And these were not disclosed. And the key element of the claim focused on whether these should have been disclosed. And the bank said they shouldn't have been. Well, the court said they should have been. So the way I look at these things is, sadly, the way society looks at them is, oh, well, so the court's made a judgment, let's move on. But the court also decided that despite that, because all of these thousands of shareholders couldn't prove in a court case that couldn't go on for 10 years, couldn't prove that, 14 years later, that had they known that information, they wouldn't have invested. The judge decided, yes, the bank behaved wrongly, but you haven't proved that that misleading information caused you to suffer any loss. Therefore, I'm not going to give you any damages. Okay? Now, so the way the media report that is Lloyd's Bank win, because no money has been paid. And that's the end of it, right? There's been a court case, that's the end of it. But the way I look at that is, actually, here's another case of a bank that is found to have completely misled innocent people who trusted it to abide by the law. And you then think about, okay, it's been decided that they were wrong. Can that have been an innocent mistake, or was that actually deliberate? And coming to your question of, so how many people are involved? Here's one example. In issuing a prospectus to raise funds for billions of pounds, in the room deciding whether you have to disclose this piece of information, this wouldn't have been something, tens of billions of pounds of loans is not something that you just, oh gosh, we forgot to mention it. That's just inconceivable. Okay? So if we take it that that's inconceivable, the corollary is it's a decision that is taken. So if you're making that decision, who do you have present in that discussion? You will have a number of the senior bankers. You will have a number of the senior lawyers. You will have a number of the brokers. You will have a number of these financial people, those financial people, the public relations people, this, that, and that. You've probably got somewhere between 15 and 30 people involved at the sharp end of that decision, and you've probably got the same again copied into the various correspondence. So you've probably got somewhere between 30 and 60 people involved. So then I wonder, is it conceivable on something that a court has said that should have been disclosed, and actually, from my understanding of the city rules, I just don't think there's any doubt it should have been disclosed. You think, how do they get to that conclusion? Because tens of billions of pounds of debt you have to disclose, and they sort of disclose it in the numbers, but what they don't disclose is that it's Emergency Bank of England funding, and that Lloyd's Bank has lent HBOS a huge part of this debt, which if they don't complete the purchase and don't raise the money, they're going to have to write off. So they disguise how desperate HBOS's situation is by not giving the complete picture. And you think, how do they get to that conclusion? Well, there's only one reason you get to that conclusion, is you realize we can't tell the truth. I mean, the natural thing to do is, that's the position, let's put it in the document. So why wouldn't you do that? Well, the only reason you don't put it in the document is because if we put it in the document, people won't take up the rights. They won't invest. If they don't invest, we're dead. We've got to be nationalized. So that's the reason. Otherwise, it would be there. So therefore, how do all of these people get to that? They find a way to create the echo chamber, to come up with some plausible explanation that they go, we're going to just put it in this way. We'll put it on page 142 in very small print, and we'll just say total debts are X. And we will convince ourselves that that is complying with the law. Now, the lawyers are paid at that time probably £800 an hour. 5 of them may be in the room on this. They're paid to get these things right, and they got it wrong. So why is the bank still using these lawyers if they keep getting this stuff wrong?
Because they want them to get it wrong is what I conclude.
Well, because they didn't get it wrong. What they did is they did a valuable service to the bank, which is we're dead unless we raise this money. And if we tell the truth, we won't raise the money. And the other venal thing about that, which adds more people to the room, is there was a woman who was a compliance officer at Lloyd's Bank called Sally Masterton. And she was a senior compliance officer. Her role was to protect Lloyd's, make sure they did everything right. And she wrote a report in 2014, a draft I think was in 2013. And in it, she said, she talks about the fundraising, and her report, which is 150 odd pages long, is all about the HBOS Reading fraud. And it's saying that there is this fraud, the evidence is extraordinary, the auditors, KPMG, are complicit. I think KPMG are mentioned 60 times in this report. Directors are complicit. And she says, if this fraud, which was known about at the time of that fundraising, was mentioned in the prospectus, the fundraising would have failed. And so there's that document that Lloyd's Bank, in deciding what documents were relevant to disclose in the shareholder action, didn't disclose. So part of the playbook is you simply don't provide disclosure of documents that are going to harm your case. Because if it was in the courts, if the judge had sight of Sally Masterton's report when making his decision in 2019, 2020 about did shareholders lose out, he would have known, well, A, I've decided that the billions of pounds of emergency loans should have been properly disclosed. But I've also got Lloyd's Bank's own compliance department saying that the HBOS Reading fraud should have been disclosed. And if it had been, that alone would have meant that the fundraising wouldn't have gone ahead. So that would have dealt with the causation issue, because if it couldn't have gone ahead, they wouldn't have had the opportunity to put in the money that they lost.
But there's exactly the same suppression of information in the post office situation, isn't there, with legal advice simply not being disclosed until it was forced out of the post office some 7 or longer years after the event. So it's
you're referring to the Clark advice.
The Clark opinion, yeah.
Yeah.
So
exactly the same thing.
One of the problems with listening to what you're saying is that we rely on the courts, the judiciary, to protect us from this kind of thing, and we can hear that the courts are somehow lagging behind. They don't seem to be able to deal decisively with this kind of situation, and so people are getting away with it, which obviously encourages more of the same. I mean, sadly, our experience, Jill and my experience with the family court in particular, is that the judiciary themselves are not willing to admit their own failings and will back away from a full and open acknowledgement of the difficulties in the judiciary in dealing with cases, and will cover up their own failings. So unfortunately, it feels like it's a culture which is spread not just in the commercial world, where people are getting money for what the frauds they manage to carry out, or the conspiracies they allow to happen, but it's also within the judiciary, which we rely on to protect us from that there's a lack of openness and a determination to protect reputations more than actually see that justice is done.
And I agree, and I think with regulators as well. But the danger of talking in this way is that it becomes very easy for people to say, well, you're just a bunch of conspiracy theorists. And one of the clever things that the people who benefit from these white-collar crimes, and when I say crimes, I'm using a small c rather than a big C, because some of them might technically be only civil wrongs rather than criminal wrongs, is that they are very good at creating terminology that creates a completely misleading impression. So conspiracy theorists, it conjures up, because of how they've used the term, conjures up an image of nutcases, believing that Bill Gates is injecting us with tracking devices through the vaccine. Whereas the reality is, if you have a view that a conspiracy has been carried out or is being undertaken, your starting point, it's got to be a theory as you then try and build your evidence.
Well, it's got to be a hypothesis which you test. I think a theory is something which is established or is untestable, basically.
Okay, so it starts even...
conspiracy hypothesis is really where we should start.
Okay, but so it's not a dirty term, but it's been turned into a dirty term.
Yeah,
in the same way, the term whistleblower has become a sort of, spit on them. Oh, someone's a whistleblower in a pejorative sense. Whereas actually, I believe that society requires whistleblowers to be encouraged and enabled. And indeed, the law is meant to impose on all organizations the obligation to make it very easy for their staff and suppliers and customers to report wrongdoing and be protected. Well, Sally Masterton, who wrote that 151-page report, she was not only dismissed, but the bank completely smeared her and continued smearing her until it was forced, with actually a bit of help from the FCA, was forced to compensate her for the second time in November 2019, and finally admit that what they'd been saying about her was wrong. So the terminology they use is very clever, in the same way that Lloyd's Bank talks about this massive fraud that Lloyd's Bank has covered up for approaching 12 years. They talk about the HBOS Reading fraud. They're there. It was a different bank that we inherited, and it was just the Reading office. Nonsense.
And all these organisations, including the post office, have access to unimaginable amounts of funding to pursue people, to pursue, whatever they want to do. And of course, the little people have no chance, really, of standing up to them, do they? I mean, an individual bank customer is very unlikely to manage to do it, just like a postmaster in the post office is very unlikely to do it. And they're forced into these unimaginably long and very wearisome actions that they have to just keep taking, don't they? You can see why I'm just sitting here thinking it's obvious. You can see what the banks want to do. You can see what the post office wants to do. Make everybody weary, make them run out of money. Let time just go by. Let's have masses and masses of time. We don't, it doesn't matter to us. And we can stop all this from really becoming a problem.
Exactly. And the other thing, so absolutely, that's what they do. They have no comeback. They have no personal risk because, as we touched on earlier, no one even gets sacked. No one's been sacked over the HBOS fraud.
No.
According to Lloyd's Bank, no one has been sacked over the HBOS fraud or the failure all this time later to have properly compensated people. They still use the same lawyers. So they must be delighted with them, even though their explanation is that we were serially incompetent in denying there was any fraud, in sacking Sally Masterton, in not following up the investigation, in not recognizing that a single one of the hundreds of complaints were legitimate, in lying to people about what was going on. Because like with the post office, where the post office said to every sub-postmaster who said, but I haven't done anything, it must be the software. They said, well, no one else has complained about the software. Well, they were saying that to hundreds of people at the same time.
Yeah.
And so there's no incentive for people to do anything than cover up. And that for me is the biggest problem. If there's no accountability, what is the difference between having laws that are not enforced and not having the laws in the first place? In practical terms, there's simply no difference.
No.
And so where does that lead? And when you start to think about that, that becomes very, very, very worrying. And it's a bit like leaded petrol. The governments knew, everyone knew for decades before it was outlawed that leaded petrol was killing thousands of people a year. But it was inconvenient to do anything about it. And so it was ignored until it was outlawed. And do you know when leaded petrol was finally outlawed in this country?
No.
Turn of the century.
Right.
I mean, it's scandalous. So I think that's right. For me, that's at the heart of it, that if covering up has no sanction, the more you cover it up, the less chance it's going to be one of those 20 or 40 or 60 that actually comes to light. And if it is one of those, the company, because it's embarrassed about it, is going to continue to delay, stall, obfuscate, suppress evidence, falsify evidence, etc., as has happened in the post office situation, as the courts have made abundantly clear has happened in the post office situation. People are going to be abused by very aggressive litigation tactics, as has happened in the post office situation. Those that settle are going to have to sign non-disclosure agreements, confidentiality agreements, which means they can't then tell others what they found out. And so it works. And the only reason it works is because the authorities, by which I mean the regulators and the courts and regulators, not just of the organizations themselves, whether that's the insurance or the financial industry or the accounting industry, but also the solicitors' regulatory authority, they don't regulate properly. So solicitors, years ago, the writing was on the wall that the solicitors in this post office scandal were behaving outrageously. And not only did the Solicitors Regulation Authority do nothing of its own bat, but when complaints were made about those solicitors, they'd write to the solicitors and say, what do you think? The solicitors would write back going, yeah, this is all nonsense. And those go, well, we've asked them and they've said it's all nonsense. Literally, that's what they've done. Now, because of all of the noise that's come out recently, and particularly one very vocal barrister who was involved called Paul Marshall and some others, because of what they are doing, the Solicitors Regulation Authority is suddenly going, oh, goodness, this could become a bit embarrassing if other organizations do things and solicitors are found to have behaved in breach of the ethics that we are meant to police, and we haven't done anything, so we better do something. So they're now, very late in the day, starting to do it. But cover-ups, if you can attempt to cover up and you fail and nothing happens, and if you succeed, yippee, you keep all your bonuses. The fact that you ruin good, honest, decent people's lives and their children's lives, and their education is stopped, their parents go to jail because of your lies, that there is a culture that's all right, because it's not about justice, it's about winning. And that's where it's also dreadfully wrong. And that, I think, is fixable if there's a will to fix it. But with what our government's doing at the moment, they seem to be the least accountable of anyone. And I say that as a lifelong Conservative.
Is it a reasonable thing to conclude by saying, Paul, that a lot of people are doing jobs? I think they're employed doing their jobs properly, but actually a lot of them are employed and are working because they are doing a job which is to cover up, to do stuff that isn't actually ethical, and they're willing to do it?
I think, this is my suspicion. I suspect that what happens is people who train to be lawyers or accountants or bankers aren't there dreaming of the day that they can sit in an office and defraud people. I don't think, most people, I go through life believing that most people are decent people. And I would like to continue to believe that's true. But what happens is, you used the word culture earlier. I think it's the culture of these places that's wrong. And people start in a business, let's take the example of a lawyer or an executive at the post office or whatever, and they start there and they're full of this hope of their career and the excitement and doing good and creating value and getting rewarded for that. And then it will start with something small. They will have to do something that just by a degree moves their sense of what is right or wrong. And that might be something very trivial. It might be, shred these documents, and you never actually read them. You don't know what they are. You've been asked by your boss to shred them. Later on, you might realize, actually, I think what I shredded might have, but by then it's too late. You're certainly not going to put your hand up and say, I think I might have done something, because you'd be sacked. And so degree by degree, they sort of are mentored and educated to become effectively a clone of the people who are banking literally millions of pounds a year in remuneration and stock options and everything else from these things. And they want to become the big cheese. And so it's why whistleblowers are so rare. And also the fact that whistleblowers then get abused dreadfully by the process and the legal system, the employment tribunals and things. The NHS is another sector where doctors who try and expose unsafe practices have their careers ruined. But I think it's just becomes accepted. And we've seen that in lots of things over history. that people say, but that's what everyone did. So therefore it's okay. And people, in a sense, you can't blame the younger people, the people in their mid-20s, late 20s, even early 30s, where they just go, but this was the time. This was the time when that's what people did. And I didn't think there was anything wrong. They don't stop to think, actually, this is wrong. And even if they do, what are their options? To become a whistleblower, go back, discuss with their husband or their wife that actually I'm going to whistleblow on this, and it probably means I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to be in legal proceedings for 3 to 5 years, and I may never be able to get a job again. You know, the answer is going to be in a discussion around the kitchen table. The answer is going to be, just leave. Don't whistleblow, just leave.
Yeah.
And on the few people that raise it, if they are able to prove it easily, then the businesses and their lawyers get them to sign confidentiality agreements. And that's the frightening thing for me. The really frightening thing. You look at the two things I've touched on particularly today, the post office and Lloyd's Bank HBOS fraud. I use that expression because that's what it's known as, not because I really think the biggest crime there is the HBOS fraud. I think it should be called the Lloyd's Bank cover-up. But you look at how close we were to neither of those being known about. On the Lloyd's situation, happened between 2003 and 2006. The criminal trial started in late 16 and finished in late January 17. And Lloyd's Bank, throughout, according to Thames Valley Police, was saying there is no evidence of any fraud and were obstructing it. And had a jury not found those people guilty, that would have been the end of it. There would have been no Griggs review, no Cranston review, no Foskett re-review. They would have just said, a finding of not guilty of a complex fraud where it's got to be proven beyond all reasonable doubt. They would have their marketing machine, their communications people saying that equals innocence and nothing to see here. And of course, the two things are completely different. So that would just be these allegations of fraud are nonsense. These people are just whingers. They failed in business. It's their fault. We would not know any. The journalists would not have had the freedom to write in the way that they are because Lloyd's Bank would have threatened them with defamation actions. And you look at the sub-postmasters and you think, well, if it wasn't for people like Alan Bates helping collate people, if it wasn't for the chap, I forget his name, at Computer Weekly, who wrote the very first
Carl
article.
Flinders.
Thank you. If it wasn't for Nick Wallace, a regional BBC reporter who happened to sit in the back of a cab and happened to say to the cabbie, well, if you've got any interesting stories, let me know, who then said, well, there's this situation. I know someone who's going through this hell. And he then did Panorama, he did this, he did that, but he was working as a freelancer, unpaid most of the time, attending all of the hearings. If it wasn't for that, and if it wasn't for, as a result, probably of part of the publicity, that gave the litigation funders the confidence to stick with it and put in another million and put in another million, that so easily could have fallen over. And if the post office and their lawyers, who at the end were also Herbert Smith Freehills, had not been so arrogant as to believe that when a judge is finding against them, what you do is you apply to have that judge removed because he is clearly biased because he's just looked through all of your nonsense. I mean, it's extraordinary to believe that that's what they did. So that was Herbert Smith Freehill's great tactic. And had they not been quite so arrogant and just said, let's bury this earlier, or the lawyers who were leading it before that, Bond Dickinson, had said, actually, you know, this could go badly wrong. You should just try and buy your way out of this and suppress it. We just wouldn't know of it.
No.
And you just think, what are the other ones that we don't know about? Or the other ones that are bubbling under? And I've touched on the bank signature forgery campaign. which I think there's now 800 separate files that have been delivered to the Serious Fraud Office across the entire country, billions of pounds, where the banks are forging. Each one is compelling evidence. Obviously, I haven't seen them all, but each one, so far as I'm aware, has compelling evidence that the bank forged someone's signature on a document that they then used to sue that person, including on many occasions to take their home. So on bank guarantees, we haven't got the documentation signed off properly, we'll forge it. And the person goes, well, here's my plane ticket. I wasn't in the country on the day you say I signed that document.
Yeah.
Neither was the person you say witnessed it.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary.